All right, so let's talk about what's going on here. So this is the evolution of evolution. So it's just a play on words. How evolution has changed over time, right? So it's a little bit of history mixed in because there's a lot of interesting history that goes along with the theory of evolution and natural selection. There was a lot of, like frenemy situations going on in the 1800s about this theory. So there's a lot of interesting ideas about how organisms change over time. One of the first is Aristotle. All right, so Aristotle was a Greek philosopher. All right, so ancient, right? He did the ladder of life. He thought that some things were higher than others. They were ordered from lowest life forms to highest life forms. You probably actually heard of that. Have you ever heard the saying, it's a lower life form? That actually came from Greek times. That came from this guy in Aristotle. But there's no vacant rungs, meaning that man is at the top of the pinnacle, and then lower organisms are organized below that point. You can't move up or down. You are where you are. And he included non-living things like rocks and things, which is interesting because rocks were at the bottom of the ladder. All right, then you have Lamarck. All right, so Lamarck was the first really, really famous scientist, and he proposed a mechanism for how organisms change. And he did that in 1809. So this all came about in the last 200 years. But he was the first guy who came how they change, because we noticed that they changed. We knew that. And he was just trying to say how they did this. So everybody can visually see that organisms change, but we didn't understand how that occurred. And so his idea was this inheritance of acquired traits. He thought that mom and dad gave you passed on these traits. So meaning like if you had a neck that was short, you could use it, and it would get longer, which is a little weird for us to think about. But in that longer neck would then pass on to its offspring. So like his famous example was these giraffes that over time its neck would get longer because it needed it to be longer because it was reaching, right? That's what he's thinking is going on. Now we know that not to be true now, but back then that was an amazing idea. He gave a mechanism for change, and a lot of people believed him for a very long time. All right, so the ancestors of giraffes had to have short necks, but they were eating up on the top of trees, and it was really hard to reach. And so they reached for higher leaves, and their necks became longer, and then those traits passed on to their offspring. And then the longer neck was passed on and passed on and passed on until the giraffes had very long necks. That was Lamarck's idea. So he had to assume a couple of things. And one of the things he assumed is that the organisms desire to change themselves. Like they wanted to change, which seems a little weird. But as humans, we do that, right? There's things that we want to change. So basically it would, in his idea, if I wanted to fly and I flapped my arms long enough, eventually, over time, I might be able to fly. Now, you and I both know that's kind of stupid, right? And then if I could fly and I grew wings because I wanted those wings, then my children would have wings. That's basically what he's saying, okay? So it's a little off, but for them, they thought it was amazing. All right, so birds tend to fly and eventually grow wings because they want to fly. Doesn't really make much sense, does it? They thought it did. All right, so he also assumed that organisms change shape by using or not using your body, meaning if you don't use it, you lose it kind of thing. So if I didn't use my wings like this bird that he shows here, then it would not have wings. All right, so they would get smaller and smaller and eventually would disappear. And the idea he gave for this was like like some of the flightless birds, the wings are kind of small, and he's saying they're in transition. They're not using them, so they're losing them. They're going away. All right, the third thing is that organisms can pass on acquired traits. So if I use my arms and grow wings because I want them, my children will have them. Sounds a little weird. Right, but that's what he was saying. So if an animal develops muscles from lifting weights, then my children would be muscle bodybuilders. You all know that's not true. First off, this man wouldn't be lifting weights. Second off, my children wouldn't be bodybuilders just because I am, right? Not necessarily. So back in the day, he thought this was a great idea. And he was really, really famous for it. And for a very long time, that's what we thought of. All right, so Lamarck was a really famous scientist. And so because Lamarck said it, even though it was wrong, everybody believed it. There was a lot of classism back then, right? So classism meaning he was in the upper class. He knew what he was talking about. We just believed him wholeheartedly. All right, so nobody kind of second-guessed him or even asked for any evidence other than what he was presenting. All right, so the classic idea that you're probably going to see about Lamarck would be the giraffe neck. That's the classic example for Lamarck. All right, so Charles Darwin, his nickname was Chuck, believe it or not, that's Chucky over here. All right, but Charles Darwin came about right in the height of Lamarckism, and he really wasn't happy with what he heard. He actually wasn't a great, student. He was okay. He wasn't fantastic. He was very interested in collecting things. So he was actually, he studied beetles, and he was really into studying beetles in college. And he really was from a high society family. He was upper crust, okay? So he was raised with a silver spoon kind of guy. He had plenty of family money, and he came home from college, and they're like, look, you got to do something. So they put him on this 5-year expedition around the world on this famous boat called the HMS Beagle. Her Majesty's ship is the HMS. So he's from, it's from England, obviously. All right, but he went on this famous trip on the Beagle, and famously they stopped at the Galapagos Islands, but they actually stopped everywhere in between, right? That was just one area, but he became really famous because that's where a lot of his ideas were solidified. So he had this idea of how organisms changed. He didn't believe Lamarck. He wasn't happy with that explanation, but nobody knew anything else. Like there was no alternative. So he's kind of thinking about this in the back of his mind. He observed so many different species, especially like imagine if I took you on a trip around the world and you've never seen anything but the animals we have here. There would be amazing discoveries, right? Lots of unique things. So he looked at all these amazing ideas and all these amazing fossils that he found. He found some really cool fossils that looked like modern organisms, but they were definitely fossils. And he kind of thought, hey, what if they're ancestors? What if they didn't just look alike, but they were alike in some ways? And that was where he started. He was become very, very famous for studying the finches on the Galapagos Islands. So a finch is a small bird. Yes, ma'am. Quickly. All right, so he studied finches. The Galapagos Islands have lots of different finches, and each island is even unique because these islands are isolated. It's an island. There's nobody going in and out of there. Oh, well. But there's nobody coming in and out. There's no immigration. And so what you wind up having is very specialized birds. And each of these birds had some unique differences, and differences enough to where they are actual different species. The tortoises are the same way on the Galapagos because the tortoise and turtle can't go anywhere. These are land turtles, so they're not going to go into the ocean as much, right? Not on purpose anyway. And so they're very specialized to particular environments on a particular island. And the blue-footed boobies, okay, I know that sounds ridiculous, but blue-footed boobies are actually birds, and they do have blue feet. They got blue webbed feet, but they're water birds. And he looked at those, and he found, this is his trip, took him 5 years. He was famously sick the entire time. He wrote about it in his memoirs quite a lot. He puked massively all the time. The poor guy never got over being not seasick. But this is where they traveled. So they traveled everywhere, didn't they? They didn't just go to the Galapagos. That was just one stop. It was just one stop and a bunch of different stops. So they traveled in a lot of different places. So it wasn't just the Galapagos that gave him this island. It was just the most famous because it had the most ideas. All right, so the Galapagos Islands are really unique because they are off the coast of Ecuador, off the coast of South America, and they are quite far from the coast of Ecuador. So they are not easily reached back in the 1800s, right? Now it's easy, but back then they didn't have any planes, they didn't have anything else. They were just on a boat. And it's very turbulent, so you can only go during certain seasons. But that's how far away they are. They're way far from the coastline, so they're way over here, away from the side of it. And they're very, very isolated. The only organisms that were there were organisms that were marooned there, meaning they are stuck there. They're not going anywhere because there's nowhere to go. It's so far the birds can't even fly there. Maybe large seabirds, but that's about it. All right, so these finches, these are the finches, okay? They all have some similarities, don't they? They're remotely similar. But each one has some definite differences. And so we noticed that each island had different finches. Each one, every time I went to this island, they would look like this. The next island would look like this. They're completely different. This guy has a tiny beak. This guy has a giant slicing beak. This guy's even bigger. So it's like, wait a second. How do these all look similar, yet have they're feeding on different things? They have differences amongst them. So we concluded that different finches must have descended from a common ancestor because they were very similar, but they had changed to be able to eat different things because each island has a completely different habitat. Some of the islands are volcanic, and they have nothing growing on them. They're very barren. Some of them have only thing that grows have these very hard nuts. And so the birds that eat or live there have to have very large beaks that can crush beaks, right? They're crushing for the nuts. Some of the islands have fruit, so you need a slicing beak instead of a crushing beak. So it depends on where they lived, is what their beaks were like. And they're completely different, but yet they look the same. So he said they had to have originated, like one bird must have been marooned on the island because of, it got blown there, probably in a storm or something, maybe a hurricane, because there's a lot of them off the coast of Ecuador. So maybe they got marooned there, and then the only thing it could eat was that, and the ones that would eat that were the ones that survived. And so over time, they all started looking in a particular manner based off of what they ate. Now, it took him about 80 years to come to that one little conclusion I just said there. It took him a long time. So his idea was this descent with modification. They start as one thing and then change over time. That's all he's saying. All right, so after his studies, he came up with 4 main ideas. Now, I'm not kidding you when I said it took him 80 years to publish it. He was not in a hurry. So Darwin literally took 80 years to publish his paper. It was crazy long time. And now what was he doing in that time? All kinds of stuff. He was a collector, right? So he used to collect beetles, then he collected finches, then he collected all kinds of stuff. He got stuck on barnacles for years because he was stuck on a ship. I guess that was one thing he could figure out. All right, but Darwin had other things. He married his cousin. Back then, honestly, that was really common because, you couldn't go anywhere. Yeah, pretty much. All right, but Darwin took forever to publish his paper. Now, his paper is massively large. It is a book. It is a huge, huge book. But it's The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection. It is one of the most famous books ever written. And it took him a long time. And I'll tell you why he finally published it in a minute. All right, so he had 4 main ideas, though. First, individuals differ. Duh, right? We know that. Everybody's a little bit different, but yet a little bit of the same. All right, and some of this variation can be inherited. Now, they didn't understand genetics fully because they didn't know about Gregor Mendel still. They were kind of getting in their idea, but nobody had ever discovered his works yet. So they knew things could be inherited, but they didn't really know how. But he knew that some of that variation has to be inherited from parents. Secondly, organisms produce more offspring that can survive. Sadly, we knew that, right? Not everybody is going to live to a ripe old age. Or not everybody's going to live to reproduce if you're an animal, right? Some don't. All right, so they have to compete for resources. So what's a resource?
Food, water, shelter.
Exactly. Food, water, shelter, something like that, right? Some sort of resource. If you're living in the wild, you are competing for those things. And only the most fittest will survive. So this idea of fitness came about. You have to be fit for your niche. You have to be fit to survive. The most fit are the ones that survive. So think about the finches, right? The ones that could crush the only food source are the ones that live. So their children, basically, their descendants are the only ones that are going to survive. So over time, couldn't you imagine that all of them look like that original guy that could survive? That's how fitness plays into it. So the most fit organisms pass on their traits to their offspring, which is why your children would have these fitness values. And in species alive today, descended with modification. That's all he said. So this huge theory that has all this contention, he only used the word evolution one time in the entire book. Do you know that? One time did he say the word evolution. And it was in the very last bit of the one thing that he said. He said evolution. Every other place in all 50 volumes, he said descent with modification. That's all he said. Over time, things change. Does it? All right, so they changed from their ancestors originally. So descent with modification. That's what Darwin said. He didn't say evolution, but one word. And what that means is organisms change over time. That's it. We know this. All right, and this happens for many, many generations. And over time, they change, right? Natural selection, it means the pressure of the environment puts on that organism determines the traits that they have, basically. What you eat and your environment determines your specific traits. Because if you're not going to survive, your traits are going to die out. Make sense? All right, so a lot of kids think that evolution is this horrible word, right? I don't know why, but in the South, it has this negative connotation. To be honest, guys, I was a Christian teacher for many years. I taught at a Christian school. We taught evolution. Okay, evolution is not this evil thing. In fact, the Catholic Church has recognized evolution many different times and said, yes, this is okay. It's not going to, harm my ideas of God or any of that. And that's your idea, whatever you think, but evolution tends to have this negative connotation, and it really isn't some harsh thing. It has nothing to do with how we originated. All it's talking about is things change, right? That's a fact. That's all it said. All right, so a lot of people get this can change. So evolution means change over time. That's it. That's all it says. So it's nothing, horrible or any of that stuff. All it's saying is that things change. And you know this. Even in your own life, you know this. All right, so we now have changed this to biological evolution. That's what Darwin's idea came about, that biological things can change over time. So that's its fancy word for what we call it now. So remember Lamarck, right? That the giraffe got a longer neck over time because they were using that neck, and that passed on to his descendants. And then Darwin says that's not really the case. So what Darwin said was, instead of Lamarck's idea that they get longer because they use them, Darwin says, well, the only ones that survived were the ones that could eat it. So if you can't eat the long leaves because your neck's too short, then over time, your descendants will have longer necks, not because they wanted longer necks, but because the longer necked giraffes survived better, which means if you survive better, then you have more offspring than the short-necked, and then over time, you just have a longer neck because they win the struggle for existence, is what he said. It's not the fact that they wanted to be longer, it's the fact that longer was better for survival. That's the difference between the two. All right, so Darwin was influenced by a lot of work from others. He was influenced by Thomas Malthus, who was a populations ecologist, James Hutton, Charles Lyell. These were all huge names in the day, and they were geological scientists. And then farmers. He actually bred pigeons. And he bred them his personal self, because remember, it took him 80 years to come up with this daggum stuff, right? So he bred pigeons for decades. And so he understood how farmers select traits. And you know this because if you want to breed a cow that produces more milk, well, and you have one cow that produces a lot of milk, one cow that produces okay, and then a bull, so you're going to keep breeding to the cow that produces more milk, and then over time, your herd that results from that is going to have, hopefully, more milk production, right? And that's all that they did. So they knew that that happened. So what Thomas Malthus is, he's a clergyman. You know what a clergyman is? So that's someone in the church, okay? And he was a scholar at the same time because the church is a patron of the sciences back in those days. All right, so he predicted that the human population would go faster than the space for food would allow. That's a really important idea. This is what solidified Darwin's idea that food availability is related to survivability. So he got that idea from Malthus. All right, so the only checks on the human population would be war, famine, disease. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? All right, so Malthus is very famous for these ideas, and it really influenced Darwin because, like I said, this is the theory of population growth. He learned about this, he read about this idea, and he said that many organisms would die, lots of offspring would die, and a lot of times it's related to food. And so when he read this, he kind of got this aha moment. He said, what determines which individuals survive and who can reproduce? And he related that idea to food because of them. All right, so James Hutton and Charles Lyell, these are geologists. So they study rocks, layers. Basically, it makes sense now because it's kind of a common idea, but these are known as the father, Hutton is the father of modern geology, and they published a lot of papers, and he said that the base layers of rocks are the oldest. And he was able to predict that Earth was millions of years old. See, before they thought it was only thousands. But he was able to predict that Earth was millions of years old, and he proposed that the oldest features are at the bottom, and they're building up over time. And this idea was important because in order for his ideas of change over time to work, it needed a long amount of time. Because if Earth was only a couple thousand years old, then you should be able to see evolution in real time, which we can now, but they didn't realize that. So after reading Lyell's book, he was convinced that the Earth was old, which is important because it would give him time to materialize these natural selected traits. So he reasoned that if geological phenomena could change on Earth, then life could change on Earth. So that influenced him. And then, of course, farmers, because remember, he raised finches for a long time. He bred them. But farmers recognize that there is always variation, and you select that variation for what you want, called selective breeding or artificial selection. And that's how we improve our animals. That's how we exchange corn. You take the biggest ears to the biggest ears, and you keep breeding that until you get a giant ear. All right, so farmers bred the plants with the most desired trait, whatever it was, And this process of humans allowing only the best to reproduce is that artificial selection. We are selecting for a specific trait. All that is natural selection is the same thing, but instead of us doing it, it's nature. That's all. We did this to dogs, guys. All of these are the exact same species. All dogs came from wolves. All of them. Their DNA is a wolf. How in the world did we get, this weird little hairy dog, I don't even remember what they're called, but Pomeranians out of a wolf? We did that. Humans did that. We changed them. We bred them to be whatever we wanted them to be. They all were this guy. They were all these wolves over here. It's crazy how we could do that. And we've done that in relatively short amount of time. We've done that in a couple of, in less than 1,000 of years. So this idea that evolution changes over time is not some evil thing.